There are men who never stand beneath the brightest lights, and yet somehow they are the reason those lights ever shine at all. Men who never score the winning goal. Men who never lift the trophy. Men whose names are never chanted by 80,000 people inside a stadium, and yet, without them, some of the greatest stories in sports might never have happened. Jorge Horacio Messi was one of those men. A father, a protector, a representative, a negotiator, a constant presence behind one of the most extraordinary football careers the world has ever witnessed. For decades, millions of people watched Lionel Messi. They watched the goals, the trophies, the Ballon d'Ors, the impossible dribbles, the nights in Barcelona, the heartbreak with Argentina, the triumph in Qatar, the move to Miami, and one final World Cup journey in North America. But behind almost every chapter of that story stood the same man, Jorge Messi. On Friday, the 7th of August 2026, Jorge Messi died in Rosario, Argentina. He was 68 years old. He had been dealing with a prolonged illness, one the family had largely chosen to keep private. And when the news became real, the football world did something it rarely does. It looked away from the superstar and toward the man standing behind him. Because for Lionel Messi, this was not the loss of an agent, not the loss of a business manager, not the loss of the man who negotiated contracts worth fortunes. This was the loss of his father. And perhaps the first real sign of what Lionel had been carrying inside came weeks earlier, in front of the entire world. It was the 16th of June, 2026. Kansas City, Argentina opened its World Cup campaign against Algeria. Lionel Messi was 38 years old, only days away from his 39th birthday. There had already been questions about how much he could still give. Could his body survive another World Cup? Could a player approaching 40 still decide matches at the highest level? Messi answered the way he had answered questions for most of his life, with the ball. Argentina won 3-0. Messi scored all 3 goals. A hat trick. Another extraordinary performance from a player who had spent more than 2 decades making extraordinary things look normal. But something happened that night that had nothing to do with football. Messi cried, not the tears people had seen after finally winning the World Cup in 2022, not the tears of celebration, not the tears of relief. These were different. Afterward, Messi explained that what he was going through had nothing to do with football. He said he had been living through difficult days. He thanked the people around him for giving him strength. He did not initially explain everything. He did not have to. Soon afterward, his family confirmed what many feared. His father, Jorge, was dealing with serious health problems and was under medical supervision. For the public, the mystery suddenly had an answer. For Lionel Messi, the World Cup had become something very different. He was trying to lead Argentina on football's biggest stage, while thousands of miles away, his father was sick. The same father who had been there when nobody knew Lionel's name. The same father who had crossed an ocean for him. The same father who had helped manage nearly every major professional decision of his life. And now Lionel was being asked to perform in front of millions while carrying a fear almost every son eventually understands. The fear that time with your father may be running out. That reality made everything surrounding the 2026 World Cup feel different. Messi continued playing. Argentina continued advancing. Once again, when his country needed him, he produced moments that seemed almost impossible at his age. Argentina eventually reached the World Cup final on July 19th. One more final. One more chance. One more night with the entire football world watching Lionel Messi. This time, however, there would be no ending like Qatar. Spain defeated Argentina 1-0 after extra time. Messi received a runner-up medal. The trophy went elsewhere. But perhaps by then, football was no longer the only thing occupying his mind. After the tournament, Messi spent time with his father. And for a family that had spent months protecting Jorge's condition from public speculation, those days carried a meaning the outside world could never fully understand. Jorge's illness had largely remained private. The family disclosed few details. There were no constant medical updates. No attempt to turn his condition into a public story. No invitation for millions of strangers to speculate about every development. That boundary was important, because fame had already taken so much privacy away from the Messi family. This they seemed determined to keep for themselves. But during the World Cup, even that privacy became difficult to protect. A false report circulated claiming that Jorge Messi had died. It was wrong. The Messi family had to respond while Jorge was still alive and receiving medical care. Imagine what that means for a family already living with uncertainty. To open a phone, to see a headline announcing the death of someone you love, while that person is still fighting to stay alive. The report was corrected. Jorge was still there. For a little longer. Then came August. And this time, the news was real. Jorge Messi had died in Rosario, the city where his family's story had begun. To understand why his death resonated so deeply through football, you have to go back decades. Before Lionel Messi became Lionel Messi. Before Barcelona. Before Argentina. Before the number 10 shirt became one of the most recognizable images in world sport. Before any of it, there was Rosario. Jorge Messi lived an ordinary working life. He worked in the steel industry. He and his wife Celia Cuccittini raised 4 children: Rodrigo, Matias, Lionel, and Maria Sol. They were not building a football empire. They were building a family, and Lionel was simply one of their children. A quiet boy with an extraordinary obsession: football. The earliest chapter of Messi's football story began at Grandoli, a neighborhood club in Rosario. And here, one detail matters. Lionel's maternal grandmother, Celia, played an enormous role in those first steps. She was the one who believed the tiny boy should be allowed to play when adults could easily have decided he was too small. Jorge was also closely involved in Lionel's early football life, including coaching him during those formative years. It was a family effort before it ever became a professional project. And the little boy kept getting better. Soon came Newell's Old Boys. At Newell's, Lionel's talent became increasingly difficult to ignore. He was small, extremely small compared with many boys his age, but when the ball arrived at his feet, size seemed to stop mattering. He could move through defenders, change direction, protect the ball, see spaces other children did not see. Then came the problem that could have ended the story before the world ever knew it existed. Messi was diagnosed with a growth hormone deficiency. Treatment was possible, but treatment was expensive. And for an ordinary family in Argentina, paying for it over an extended period was difficult. Suddenly, this was no longer simply about whether a talented child could become a professional footballer. It was about whether his body would be given the medical support it needed to develop. There were no guarantees. There rarely are when the future depends on a child. Jorge had to make a decision. Continue hoping that a solution would appear in Argentina, or search somewhere else. Eventually, an opportunity emerged thousands of miles away: Barcelona. In 2000, Lionel traveled to Spain for an opportunity with FC Barcelona. He was 13, small, shy, thousands of miles from everything familiar. But once Barcelona's football people saw him play, the possibilities became impossible to ignore. The club eventually committed to bringing Lionel into its youth system and helping provide the medical treatment he needed. The story of that agreement would later become part of football mythology. When Barcelona's commitment needed to be put into writing, sporting director Carlos Rexach famously wrote an initial agreement on a napkin, a simple piece of paper, a decision involving a 13-year-old boy. No one at that table could have known what would follow. Jorge did know one thing: his son had been given a chance, and he was not going to let that chance disappear. The move to Spain demanded enormous sacrifice. Rosario was home. Family was there. Friends were there. Their lives were there. Barcelona was unfamiliar, and Lionel was still a child. Eventually, parts of the family returned to Argentina. Jorge stayed closely involved with Lionel. That relationship became even more important as the boy moved deeper into Barcelona's system, because football talent was only one part of what had to be managed. There were contracts, expectations, money, agents, executives, sponsors, media, pressure, and eventually global fame on a level almost no footballer had experienced before. Lionel kept growing, and the football world began to change around him. He reached Barcelona's first team. Then came the goals, then the trophies, then the records, then the arguments over whether this quiet kid from Rosario might be the greatest footballer ever to play the game. And as Lionel's profile grew, Jorge's role changed with it. He became his son's longtime representative. He handled negotiations and business matters. He sat across from executives representing some of the biggest institutions in world sport. To the public, Lionel Messi was becoming an icon. To Jorge, he was still his son. That distinction is important because football relationships come and go. Coaches leave. Presidents lose elections. Teammates transfer. Agents are replaced. Clubs change. But Jorge remained. When Lionel was celebrated, Jorge was there. When Lionel was criticized, Jorge was there. When contracts had to be negotiated, Jorge was there. When enormous career decisions had to be made, Jorge was there. And when everything became complicated, Jorge was still there. For more than 2 decades, Barcelona became inseparable from the name Messi. Lionel produced a career there that almost sounds fictional when reduced to numbers. Goals, league titles, Champions League trophies, Ballon d'Ors, records broken and broken again. But no career lasts forever. In 2021, the relationship between Messi and Barcelona reached the ending almost nobody had imagined. Lionel had to leave. The farewell was emotional. A grown man who had arrived in Barcelona as a 13-year-old stood before cameras and cried as he said goodbye to the club that had become his professional home. Once again, Jorge was deeply involved behind the scenes as his son's representative. The next destination was Paris Saint-Germain. Paris offered a new challenge, a new league, a new club, and another major transition for a player who had spent almost his entire professional life in one place. 2 years later came another decision: the United States. Inter Miami. For many people, it looked like the final major chapter of Lionel Messi's club career. But Messi did not simply arrive in America to quietly disappear into retirement. Stadiums filled. Ticket demand exploded. Fans traveled enormous distances just to watch him. And the player approaching 40 continued producing moments that reminded everyone why the name Messi had become something larger than football itself. Through Barcelona, through Paris, through Miami, Jorge remained part of the machinery behind Lionel's career. But their story was never perfect. No real family story is. One of the most difficult chapters came in Spain. Lionel and Jorge faced legal proceedings over taxes connected to income from Lionel's image rights between 2007 and 2009. In 2016, both were convicted on 3 counts of tax fraud involving approximately 4.1 million euros. Lionel initially received a 21-month prison sentence. Jorge initially received the same sentence, which Spain's Supreme Court later reduced to 15 months. The prison terms did not result in either man serving time behind bars and were ultimately replaced with financial penalties. It was an uncomfortable and very public chapter, and it is important not to erase it, because telling the story of Jorge Messi only through sacrifice and triumph would make him less human, not more. There were difficult decisions. There were mistakes. There were legal consequences. There were moments when the Messi family's business affairs became global headlines for reasons they would have preferred to avoid. Greatness rarely comes wrapped in a perfectly clean story. The bigger the career became, the more complicated everything around it became. And Jorge lived inside that complexity with his son. But there is another side to their story. Look past the business meetings. Look past the courtrooms. Look past the transfer negotiations. Look past the millions. And eventually, everything returns to something much simpler. A father and a son. A father who once looked at a small child from Rosario and decided that the child's dream deserved a chance. A father willing to leave familiarity behind. A father willing to navigate a world neither of them could have imagined when Lionel first kicked a ball around Grandoli. And a son who, even after becoming one of the most famous athletes on earth, continued trusting his father with some of the biggest decisions of his life. That is why the reaction to Jorge's death spread far beyond his family. Newell's Old Boys mourned him. Barcelona expressed its condolences. The Argentine Football Association paid tribute. CONMEBOL joined the messages of sympathy. Real Madrid also sent condolences. Across Argentine football, moments of silence and black armbands became part of the tributes. Different clubs, different institutions, different rivalries. But on this, football spoke with one voice. Because whatever people thought about Jorge Messi as an agent or businessman, his influence on Lionel's journey was undeniable. Without Jorge, there is no way to know what Lionel Messi's story would have become. Maybe the talent would still have found a path. Maybe someone else would have discovered him. Maybe another club would have paid for his treatment. Maybe history would somehow have reached the same destination. But history does not work through maybes. What actually happened is much simpler. A family believed. A grandmother pushed a tiny boy onto a football field. A father helped guide him. A family confronted a medical problem. An opportunity appeared in Barcelona. Jorge took the risk. Lionel took the opportunity. And football changed forever. Years later, Jorge got to watch his son reach heights no family from Rosario could reasonably have imagined. He watched Lionel become Barcelona's greatest icon. He watched him win the Ballon d'Or again and again. He watched Argentina suffer painful defeats. He watched his son briefly walk away from international football. He watched him come back. He watched Argentina finally win the Copa America. And then, in December 2022, he watched the moment that completed the story millions of people thought would remain unfinished forever. Lionel Messi lifted the World Cup. For the world, it was the crowning achievement of a legendary career. For a father, perhaps it was something even simpler. The little boy had made it. The child whose growth had once worried doctors. The child whose treatment cost more than the family could comfortably afford. The child who crossed the Atlantic carrying an impossible dream. Was standing on top of the football world. 4 years later, there was one more World Cup. At almost 39 years old, Lionel took Argentina all the way to another final. There would be no second consecutive trophy. Spain won. Argentina finished second. But by then, the Messi story had already become bigger than any single result. And somewhere beneath the football narrative, another story was reaching its final chapter. Jorge's health was deteriorating. Lionel knew it. His family knew it. The tears against Algeria suddenly made sense. The difficult days Messi spoke about were not about missed chances or pressure or criticism. They were about home. They were about family. They were about his father. That may be the most revealing image of Lionel Messi's final World Cup. Not a goal. Not a dribble. Not the runner-up medal. But the greatest footballer of his generation pulling his shirt toward his face and trying to control his emotions because, behind everything the world could see, he was still someone's son. And no trophy can protect you from that. No amount of money can stop time. No stadium can drown out grief. No Ballon d'Or makes losing a parent easier. For nearly his entire life, Lionel had known Jorge as a constant presence. Before fame, during fame, through success, through controversy, through Barcelona, Paris, Miami, Argentina, World Cups, courtrooms, contract negotiations, family celebrations. Jorge was there. Now he isn't. And that absence is something no statistic will ever explain. Jorge Messi will never be remembered for scoring a goal in a World Cup final. He never won the Champions League. He never lifted the Ballon d'Or. His name will never appear beside Pelé, Maradona, Cristiano Ronaldo, or his own son in debates about the greatest footballers who ever lived. That was never his role. His role happened away from the pitch. His role was believing before the rest of the world had a reason to believe. His role was helping a child reach the place where talent could become history. His role was staying close when that history became too large for any ordinary family to control. And maybe that is why this loss feels different. For most of the world, Lionel Messi is an icon, a number 10, a World Cup champion, a symbol of football. For Jorge Messi, before any of that existed, Lionel was simply his boy. And for Lionel, Jorge was never simply the man sitting across from Barcelona executives. He was his father, the man connected to the beginning of everything. There is a strange truth about greatness. The world remembers the person standing on the stage. It remembers the person holding the trophy. It remembers the name on the shirt. But behind almost every extraordinary life are people whose sacrifices cannot be measured with statistics. People who drove to training. People who found the money. People who made phone calls. People who said yes when the safer answer was no. People who believed when the dream still looked unreasonable. For Lionel Messi, Jorge was one of those people. And now, as football mourns his passing, perhaps the most meaningful way to remember Jorge Messi is not through the contracts he negotiated, or the money he managed, or even the controversies that followed him. It is to return to Rosario, to imagine a small boy with a football, a family with no idea what the future would become, a medical diagnosis that could have changed everything, a father facing a decision, and then an airplane leaving Argentina for Spain. No guarantee of success. No promise of a Ballon d'Or. No promise of Barcelona. No promise of a World Cup. Only belief. That belief became a career. That career became history. And that history changed football forever. Jorge Messi did not score the goals, but he helped create the conditions in which they could be scored. He did not lift the trophies, but he stood behind the boy who eventually would. He did not need 80,000 people chanting his name. The legacy was standing in front of him all along. His son, Lionel Messi, the legend the whole world knows, and the son Jorge believed in before the world knew his name. Rest in peace, Jorge Messi.